This is so exciting for me because this is so much of my day-to-day world is spent on this topic. And it's a topic that maybe at first glance doesn't seem shiny, doesn't really seem sexy, but the reality is the long-term implications very much are, right? Because it's coming down to the very real, very relevant, salient topic of how do we progress human health and human progress. And that means things like understanding, how to cure diseases. Earlier, you could hear in the voice of one of our colleagues the passion and the urgency around climate change. These types of topics, right? So this is where the rubber meets the road. This is the concept behind what scientific research is really all about foundationally. So Ishwar, it is a pleasure to have you here. This will be an interview-style conversation, but we really want engagement from you as well. So looking forward to kicking off.
So first of all, thank you, Traci, and everybody from Elsevier for inviting me for this. And I think it's a great opportunity to share what we have been attempting to do working with the Generalist repositories. It's conceptually different and new in the approach we are taking and how to make this work. It's, one could say that it's just simple, plain collaboration, but the approach here itself is what we call co-opetition. And so I think that's what we hope that we can share with you a little bit through this conversation. And so again, thank you for having me here.
My pleasure, yeah. So I told you I would have a quirky slide for this. Repository roulette, what is that? So Ishwar and I have been having many conversations over the course of the last 2 days about the differences in repositories. So, obviously if you're familiar with NIH's guidance, you would first go to a domain-specific repository, right? And if one is not available, you have a generalist repository. But we also hear, well, what is a data repository versus an institutional repository? So let's pause there for a moment and just talk about that. How would you define and differentiate between these?
Yes, I think it's a landscape that still needs to be kind of defined, and there are some blurry lines. But very simply put, at least the guidance from NIH is that if your data has a particular data type related repository, please use that. You might have gotten guidance from your program, your funding opportunity, that this data generated should go in this database, and that's what we would use. That's step one. If you don't have that and there isn't clarity, or there is a combination of data types that come out of any study, which is often the case, then you kind of go through a workflow and a chart to kind of try to understand things that are directly associated with publications and are less than 2 GB go in PubMed Central associated things. Things that are larger than that could go into a generalist repository or an institutional repository if they don't quite have the right home. And of course, if you have extraordinarily large data sets that are part of a large consortium study or a big data study, then you presumably have cloud-based services and storage that are part of that, which could also be indexed and kind of connected to a domain or a generalist repository. So there's some broad guidance, but I think it depends and varies on the use cases. And so we put in many checks and balances to provide that guidance, but I think there's still work in progress, and I think it takes a village to kind of get that message across.
And yesterday we heard from Brittany at Whistle. Oh, there she is. Yes, thank you. You set us up perfectly, Brittany. Thank you so much. But one of the things that we heard Brittany talk about was, but first and foremost, she made it clear, and I want to provide this context for all of you in the room as well. So I work very closely with Luca Belletti, who's product manager for Digital Commons Data and technical product manager for Mendeley Data as well. And but I am also working with him on Mendeley Data, specifically as it relates to the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative. Well, Mendeley data, coming from the previous world of tech, it's the freemium version of Digital Commons data, which is like a premium product which is an institutional data repository. And one of the things that I heard Brittany say is, we used our institutional repository for a period of time, but we needed to make that change. So could you talk a little bit, Ishwar, about why you feel an institutional data repository or generalist repository that leads to an institutional data repository might be a better place to store your data sets than a general institutional repository? It's a lot of repositories, and that's why that's the title of the slide.
So, again, I think the short answer is it depends on the use cases and what you want to do. But also, I think it's an opportunity, and we just had this at the data table discussion, is giving people the choice. So I think if your researcher puts on their thinking hat, they want to be able to be in the driver's seat and manage the data and what we call data stewardship in the most responsible way. Ideally, the good citizen wants to do that. Again, there's an incentive for it, because if they do that right, they get the right data citations, they get the credit for that, and they kind of, it's a win-win for them. So giving the researchers as much choice is step one over there. So, and I think depending on the use cases, and then we were having some discussions about when does, putting it into an institutional repository that's discoverable in the public also gives some institutional control and stewardship of it as well, which is something that the OSTP policy and the Nelson memo requires and expects some institutional responsibility associated with the data. So that's kind of another reason.
For the people in the back, did you hear that? Requires and expects. Excellent. Okay, so
we start with an encouragement.
That's right. We're in encouragement phase now, right? We're moving to expectation shortly. Okay, so moving on from repository roulette. Now that we're grounded in some context, how and why did the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative come about? Can you give us the backstory?
So, I should use the microphone. It simply came about because I wouldn't necessarily say just the policy drove it, but I think it's really driven based on making sure there's homes for every type of data. And when the policy came out from the NIH on data management and sharing, we wanted to make sure every data type that was generated by our research studies had a home. And we wanted to make it relatively easy for data sharing, at least to begin with. And so that was kind of the primary driving force for it to come together.
Excellent, thank you. And so the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative has several goals, 5 goals, key goals. And there's a very pretty colorful slide here that you can absorb for yourself. But would you like to share a little bit about these and summarize and what's important about this?
Absolutely. So I think the first one over there is just make it easier for researchers to share data. I mean, so there was a requirement for it. Even if there isn't a requirement for it, I think in their own interest, how do you make it easier? So that's kind of what the driver was. And we noticed through some preliminary analysis in a pilot study that there was already a trend and an uptick in the use of generalist repositories, whether it was in Figshare or other dryads of the
data.
world. So that is what kind of, so that's the first goal, making it simply easier. It's kind of fairly straightforward. The second thing was we wanted to kind of know for ourselves, show us the data. Where is the NIH-funded data? So we wanted to be able to discover it, and we knew it was not in one place. There was no way it could be in one place, given the enormity of the number of institutes we are comprised of and the number of research projects going on, and given that everybody had choices. So we wanted to be able to easily discover this. And so we wanted to kind of have a much better idea of the iceberg under the water in terms of data associated with our funding opportunities. Um, of course, the inevitable outcome is replicability and reproducibility of our research itself. And so we wanted to kind of make sure that this, we are improving the rigor of reproducibility and replicability of results. And we have some efforts and funded projects in this area itself where people have done some analysis to kind of demonstrate that. So I think that given that importance, we wanted to, that was another objective as well of GREI. Um, the fourth point in terms of duplication is we realize that people have the option to share data in multiple places in different ways, and then inadvertently they have different versions of it showing up in different places, and there's no connectivity. We have our own, we have many examples of our own studies that are sampling the same populations or the same cohorts, conducting different study, and there's no linkage that these are the same individuals who participated in this, and then trying to look across that becomes another study and an enormous challenge in of itself. So the last point is kind of seems quite obvious, but I think sometimes everybody doesn't, we wanted everybody to become contributors and consumers of data because then they understand and they can empathize, because when people are just on one side of the show, they don't quite understand what the challenges of it, particularly when it comes to sharing and providing information associated with data. So these are all one or more ways of actually kind of inculcating best practices of data management and sharing.
Okay, and you mentioned the co-opetition working group model, right? And presently there are 7 generalist repositories. You mentioned a few. Obviously, Mendeley data is one. Zenodo, Figshare, Dryad, Vivly, Harvard Dataverse, and OSF. So the logos that you see on the screen. Can you talk a little bit about that process? How did these 7 repositories come to be a part of this working group?
Certainly, yeah. So we had certain objectives as we kind of outlined in the earlier slide, and then this picture shows you a little bit more in the details of what exactly we wanted them to do in terms of streamlining metadata or developing common metrics, educating the community in terms of best practices of what FAIR means in terms of making their data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The way we went about this is we put out a solicitation out there for anybody who was an established repository that kind of adopted and adhered to open science principles, made data sharing, I'm just trying to recall some of the eligibility criteria over here in terms of providing free access to data, and already supporting biomedical data. So we had 5 or 6 eligibility criteria. So we did not want to essentially bring people together who were not already established supporting biomedical data, and we didn't want to do that to keep the light bulbs on for the repository. It was more really for them to come together to lower that barrier for entry for researchers through this co-opetition process by what we defined, and I'll tell you how we got to defining that as capabilities below the value chain. So some common things like metadata and metrics, everybody needs to address it. So everyone doesn't need to reinvent the wheel over there. So how can we kind of divide and conquer this and then kind of get everybody on the same page? So that was kind of the driving force. How did we arrive at this? We actually organized a workshop on discoverability and reuse of data. Some of you may have attended this way back in 2020. And I don't think those who attended, and neither will I and the organizing group, forget it, because it was the last in-person meeting before everybody shut down for the pandemic. So it's kind of a point on the map over there. But so we actually had a data librarian come in and kind of share this concept of co-opetition. The concept itself was not new, on identifying these capabilities that are below the value line, recognizing them, agreeing to kind of work on those together, and then dividing and conquering it, while still retaining things that are above that to kind of retain the competitive edge and compete in those areas, recognizing that you don't kind of step on each other's unique value proposition offerings as each repository. So that's kind of how this came about. And when we put out the solicitation, we had the 7 fairly kind of well-known repositories kind of put in the application. So.
Thank you. Okay, so further context, and now we arrive at the meat and potatoes section. So, real world impact. Let's start with the definition of that. You say that word, it sounds a bit like an abstract concept, right? So how do we define that first and foremost?
So could I flip that question over to you? What is your understanding of that?
Sure, yeah. So, well, and I'll share things that you've shared with me that inspired me. But when you think of real world impact, can you answer a question such as, has this data resulted in research or publications that have saved lives? Has this yielded a vaccine? Has it provided access to clean water? Has it transformed a geography, right? Ultimately, that's the way that I think of it in real world stories, right?
No, I think that's a great way, and she did a better job than I would have. So what I would do is, and so that's the ultimate goal, but it's so hard to kind of get to that point, right? So I think if we dial that back, I think taking baby steps towards that is how do we kind of, take a process or simplify that and say something takes 10 steps to do in terms of analytics, and how do you kind of reduce that and lower that barrier to energy? Because it's very hard for people to understand it. They use data every day, and yet people don't understand or comprehend that they're actually using their own data or somebody else's data to kind of build on that the hypothesis that they're building on to answer the question. So I think it's kind of recognizing that, and how do they take the building blocks and build on top of that to get to that ultimate goal would be the example. So we have several examples of near real world impact that I think the generalist repositories are trying to demonstrate. And we are encouraging that through funding opportunities for secondary analysis, so we can kind of see what people are coming up with, what questions they're trying to answer, and what challenges they face in trying to answer based on data that's available already. And in doing so, we hope that people will have a better appreciation for what needs to be provided and given along with that data to make it easier to kind of answer those real world questions.
Yeah, and maybe to tie this back to a session yesterday, when you think about, the value of the IR, the transparency of the IR itself, and yielding, as Paul Royster, talked about the popularity of the tractor tests. And it's a simple real-world example, but it's an example of that has utility, that has purpose, that impacts agriculture, which impacts the food that goes into our mouths, right? So, analogous to that is this idea or this concept that somewhere along the line that has to trace back to a data set, right? Somewhere there's data and it could be multimedia, but ultimately that influenced or resulted in that publication that was showcased, that was cited, etc.
And that traceability is important, and also giving credit to whoever stewarded that data is also a really important part of it, because if it's many steps away, then the original contributor to that data gets often forgotten or lost in that process.
Mm-hmm. So kind of segueing to this concept of, I think we've largely answered the question of why data reuse matters, because data reuse is the thing that allows us to get to that real world impact. But let's talk a little bit more about those barriers to entry, the things that are blocking us from being able to, to more consistently and more often ascertain what is secondary use, right?
So the way I would kind of define that is really looking at ability to combine data that people are generating, because everyone has a certain focus and they're developing things. But at least if you look at a clinical study, the ideal scenarios were one giant cohort, right, of a combination of normal and not so normal conditions that we want to kind of measure and track. But we don't necessarily conduct our studies in that fashion. We're kind of just going about each time starting building a cohort from scratch. So the question is, and that's what one of our flagship programs called the All of Us program is attempting to do, is build this giant cohort across the country and collect up to 1 million people, so that those who want to conduct specific targeted studies could simply tap into that and identify a subset of people based on the metadata collected, based on some other metric that's already available over there. And that gives you such a huge jump start as opposed to trying to start building a cohort from scratch. And believe it or not, every time somebody does that from scratch, they have completely different rule sets. They don't use common data elements or things, and the story goes on. So I think that's the biggest stumbling block in terms of not adopting metadata standards, in not being able to reuse data itself, and taking appropriate approaches for managing the research data early on in the research life cycle will help do that and have greater reuse of that data.
And so, coming into GREI, one of the based on that, one of the very first recommendations that GREI issued were metadata recommendations, right? What's your hope? What do you imagine if all of the generalist repositories follow these recommendations? How do you think that might impact the ecosystem?
So this is baby steps and step one. So what we're doing through generalist repositories, since they're at a kind of an Uber level, it's mostly collecting fundamental study level metadata. So it's actually not collecting sample level metadata, as Brittany and I were talking a little bit about, individual projects and studies. But you do need that study level metadata before you can even think about combining the sample level metadata. So I think the fundamental thing, as simple as it might seem, in what GREI is doing is making people aware of the importance of harmonizing and collecting metadata, even if it's at the study level and doesn't take you all the way down to being able to compare, combine data sets.
Yeah, we formed a metadata supergroup, but I kind of feel like we're like metadata care bears, just like putting our bellies out to the world with a ray of sunshine. It's, clean up your metadata, please. How many of you, we were talking yesterday, how many of you have heard of the Data Parasite Award? Show of hands. Oh, wow. Do you want to share a little bit about the Data Parasite Award?
Well, I think it's been quite, I don't have it in my fingertips, but it's basically being able to reuse somebody else's data and find some interesting discovery of that. And we do all use that, and anybody in the genomics world understands and recognizes probably the data parasites. And these are some viewed as a great thing and others not so, because there's this whole school of people who think that you don't necessarily understand the context in which the data was generated, and you might not appropriately use it or interpret it. But I think, and that's where the metadata and other additional information associated with that is important. But I think the importance of secondary data, we all draw conclusions just in day-to-day life, not looking at scientific data based on data and information that's available, whether it's right or wrong. So trying to adopt the same thing in reuse of data in a kind of a structured way in science also kind of serves us. And oftentimes it's whether you're reproducing a method in a paper or replicating the experiment, all of that depends on reusing the data. And that's a huge struggle for any grad student who's gone through that will fully appreciate and understand that the first 3 years of their graduate studies is just trying to do experiments somebody else did, which is not working. So,
Not what they had in mind. 80 hours of Western blots. Okay. Let me pause there. Yeah. So we live in a landscape where it's clear that it's a challenge. It's a challenge to be able to even discern or differentiate primary from secondary data, right? Or data data producers and data reusers. So what are you seeing happening? And I can share a little bit from our side, things that we're working on. But what are you seeing happening presently to overcome that challenge?
So, I mean, what we're at least trying to do, and I'm trying to think what I thought of, but it's fallen out of my head. One of the things is, I think I mentioned this, we do have funding opportunities to encourage this, to kind of understand and encourage people to kind of use it and then share with us what the troubles that they have. But I think you were going to get to this later in our brief chat. We do have competitions and challenges that incentivize people to kind of do this. And so one of the things that we have is the DataWorks Challenge, that is a partnership with the Federation for American Societies in Experimental Biology, to be able to demonstrate stories of successful data sharing or reuse. And we've done this for 3 years now, and this year's competition is in fact partnering specifically with the Generalist repositories to see how much of the data in Generalist repositories can actually be reused. And so at the end of the day, our goal is trying to make all of the data that's available useful and usable. Because again, there's the thing is, there are requirements for data sharing, but then how do we kind of figure out what data is best shared, when should it be shared, and what's the value of sharing it? And we want to be able to kind of speak to that. And we've seen great trends in looking at some preliminary metrics that data is definitely being shared in Generalist repositories, but we don't quite know exactly to what extent it's being reused and through other publications or citations. And so that's what we're hoping to kind of measure. This competition is still open. And it closes on October 23rd, actually, so for applications. So if you do want to share this amongst your researchers, it's kind of basically another funding opportunity to do some secondary analysis on data sets that somebody else has generated, not their own data that they have generated, because then they have other information under the blanket that they might not be publicly available in repositories that they would use for the analysis. So.
I'm curious. So for those of you out there who maybe have the responsibility as an IR manager for RDM, research data management, and you're supporting researchers through that life cycle, how many of you have any benchmarks for secondary use? Is there any way that you, by show of hands, is there any way that you are aware that secondary use or data reuse is happening at your institution on behalf of your researchers?
I don't think so, right?
Yeah.
And we were talking at the data table next door that it's primarily some of the IRs and even some of the GRs are essentially established for the purpose of sharing and not necessarily for the purposes of reuse. And particularly the use case of some restricted access data came up that yes, there's a notation that the data has limited access, but then beyond that, what's the process and the due diligence one should go through to be able to actually get your hands on that data so that you can actually use it for something downstream. And that's not quite, the workflow is not quite built in and available. And I think that's something that needs to be explored. So.
Yeah. And for Elsevier's part, in addition to being the PI for GREI, I'm also the PI for another project which originally started as part of the Democratizing Data Initiative with Dr. Julia Lane. There were several other participants. Johns Hopkins University was one. Randy could probably speak even more adequately to the initial phases of this. But it's now evolved. It's become a research data discovery project, and this is one of the things that we're doing. We're using full text search to be able to help identify where primary and secondary use exists. And the theory is, the thought process is, if we can parse between those two, we may be able to get to a point of replicable methodology for the wider community to be able to do the same, but also then to analyze one step further to better understand what are the behaviors that are leading to reuse that actually matter for for the real world impact, right? So bringing it back to that, this is why it matters. So it's tedious. It's not there's not a short term way to do this or work around. Although after all the discussion around AI, now I'm curious about some of those interventions. But that is that's what we're ultimately working to get towards, and it's been very, I think, fulfilling to see Elsevier's open science policy work alongside Harvard's, work alongside Zenodo's, shout out to and to Josh in the back, work alongside Vivli, to this end, because ultimately the impact is one that can truly make a difference for our society and for our world.
And what I would add is what we're attempting through the collaborative efforts of the Generalist repositories and the work products that come out of that can hopefully be used by many others as well. So the impact goes way beyond what the Generalist repositories are doing, whether it's in the thought process and starting to think along those lines, or the actual tangible recommendations, or if the piece of code that's available that's out there in the open source. And in fact, I should also give credit to the Generalist repositories for anything that they're working together. They are managing the project, or starting to manage that openly on a GitHub repository in of itself, so that the community can actually kind of get an idea of what's available out there. We haven't, and this is just in the works this year, and I'm kind of giving you kind of a sneak peek to that already, but so it should be available, if not already, very soon, right?
Yes, correct. We're also organizing community calls to take feedback to inform our Year 4 plan, so that we can actually work on initiatives that matter to all of you, and that will have the highest level of impact for your institutions as well. With that, I think,
So broadly, I was just trying to figure out what big message you guys, I could give you guys, and I would say there's at least one of two things. One is kind of just trying to provide as many options as available to your researchers, so that whether the Nelson memo or funders' policies are not looked at as a burden and a compliance requirement, but more as something, how do you kind of incentivize them, and what's in it for them in terms of being a researcher, or getting their tenure, or how can they kind of demonstrate better research practices, or something of that sort. That would be kind of one big thing. So that way they're much more responsive and kind of actually kind of coming to you, rather than you having to go to them. You want them to come to you. That would be one thing. The other thing is helping everybody realize that there's a role for every stakeholder, whether you're a researcher, whether you're a funder, whether you're a repository manager, or an administrator at an institution. And if any, we need everybody to kind of work together for it to really be kind of move forward and be successful, because everybody has a part to play over there. And I think some people recognize that, but not all stakeholders recognize it and say that they have to be the good citizen and make their contribution as well. So that's what makes it easier. And the last but not the least, for each one to kind of think, what can I do to make a difference or make a change over here? So because we can't always kind of say, oh, the system is problematic, or there's something else coming in the way over here, because there's always bureaucracy and there's always all these other hurdles. But the question is, what one thing can I do to make a difference? And if everyone thinks that way, I think we can move the needle forward, because again, it's more than just policy, it's more than infrastructure and software. It's really kind of a mindset and a culture change. And how do we bring that about collectively together? And that's what kind of sums up co-opetition.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ishwar. And with that, would love to provide time for you to ask your burning questions or just to engage in conversation around this topic.
Hi, Ishwar. Hi, Tracy. I'm Josh. In terms of thinking about the reusability of data and data sets, it just kind of, in hearing you talk, I was just, in my mind, thought about Kaggle, and they have a data set usability index. And so I was wondering, because I'm new to GREI on the project, has the project reached out to places like Kaggle and others that have some other experience in terms of reuse and maybe lessons learned?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and I think the possibility is definitely there. I mean, you guys drive the project and the program in terms of what you want to do. This was a competition that FASEB reached out to us, so we kind of enabled it, but we can definitely enable competitions through other platforms and modes as well. And we do have other competitions using the dream challenges that are focused on cancer, and then there's several others actually. So in fact, if you go to challenge.gov, you can see the number of competitions and the number of types of platforms being used for a variety of different things. So yeah, absolutely, we have the option to do this. And there are some data challenges that I think the administrative side of federal agencies are using, leveraging Kaggle and so on and so forth. So definitely, if you have the idea, absolutely, we can do that. Other questions for either of us, whether it's...
Even if it feels like, one of my favorite phrases is, treat me like I'm a kindergartner. So, even if there's something that feels very elementary, because this is a topic that is very often on the periphery, and yet it's, we're trying to bring it more to the forefront because of the critical nature. So, yes. Ann. Oh, sorry. She's bringing a microphone.
I find the whole co-opetition model fascinating, and I was wondering if there were any underlying challenges or tensions experienced as part of that and how you navigated successfully through them.
So I would say that I think the most important thing in any of this is trust. And it took a while. I wouldn't say there was no trust or anything to begin with. That's why we carefully chose what things are below the value line for folks to discuss and work on. And even there, we have complete freedom to kind of, for folks to come to NIH or me and say, well, this might be kind of touching a little bit on a competitive area, which would be a unique value proposition. So there's enough to go around. So we very carefully choose what areas for people to collaborate and work on. And there's no reason for everybody to have to collaborate on everything. And I think the idea is, how do we make progress forward together? on things. If everybody collaborates on a topic, that of course gets the highest priority and the vote and goes up on the list. But that's an exercise that we do essentially, and we're trying to do this now collectively, openly with the community as well, so that there's weigh-in from program and NIH's objectives, obviously, but that's at the very end. But I actually look at the generalist repositories on the leading edge of what needs to be done for the community and weigh in their priorities. And they call that the parking lot. And the parking lot keeps growing every day. There's always enough parking spots there. So, but they choose from that and prioritize based on what their own roadmaps provide input, as well as what the community gives them, and then kind of overlay that with what NIH's objectives are to kind of arrive at that priority. That's not an easy task, and it requires considerable iteration, and we keep doing that, right? I mean, Traci's been driving that for the last year now, and it's definitely not easy. So that's what kind of makes it easy to kind of to keep it an ongoing and a moving target. And I think we've got to sometimes read between the lines also to figure out when to move something out or when bring it back in or change its priority depending on how things evolve. So I wouldn't say it has been touchy or difficult to do that. And I think just building that trust and working with each other.
Thank you. One last quick question. How much is the cash prize for the contest?
So it's the total prize is a $500,000 cash prize. Yeah, but it's not for one person. So there's kind of multiple winners and there's multiple rounds to it. So this particular competition is demonstrating reuse of others' data in generalist repositories. So we take in applications till the 23rd. And then we do a kind of an assessment of that and select those that are eligible to kind of move forward based on the projects that they have proposed. And for being selected initially to run their analysis, they're given, I forget exactly, $25,000 or $30,000 to kind of do some of the preliminary work. And then when they complete the work and the analysis and they submit their write-up or a paper or whatever it is, a data paper, they will go through a full evaluation with judges from NIH, and then there would be, I think, 3 top winners of, 100,000, 75. I don't remember the exact numbers. I think you had it on the slide. So, no, you don't have the price on the slide. That's okay. Yeah.
Good point.
So I do want to add one other thing. I mean, I think this is a group of librarians and folks from the libraries and what I refer to them as data stewards. And I have to say, at least for the program, you correct me if I'm wrong, Traci, we've had an overwhelming response and engagement from the librarian community, I would say, providing us feedback. So it's a shout out to all of you for taking the lead at your institutions, for bringing in the best practices, but also feel free to kind of reach out to all of them in sharing some of your pain points, what you think can be done. And I know you've all been kind of super engaged in giving input to the product roadmap for additional comments, but I think if you take it to another level in terms of just the core capabilities even, that applies across to all of them, and even beyond that, other repositories as well. So that would be hugely helpful as community input to that parking lot of capabilities that they're collecting. So again, thank you, and keep the input coming.
Okay, thank you all very much for your time. And now we are going to have a break, returning back here at 3:35 p.m. Thank you all.